Hello, dear friends, dear community. Welcome on behalf of the BTS Center to Stories of Grief and Courage, a conversation with Hannah Malcolm and Anupama Ranawana, each of whom contributed to this book, Words for a Dying World, a collection of stories that explores how we go about talking about climate grief in the global church, and also what we do, what we ought to do with that grief once we've found words to identify it and express it. My name is Aram Mitchell. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as the Director of Partnerships and Formation at the BTS Center, an organization based in Portland, Maine, where we're doing what we can to deepen community, deepen conversations, and deepen commitments of spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. And right now I'm sitting in a little room in my little home that's situated on a little plot of land near the Presumpscot River, which is one river among many that flows through the forests and fields of the state known as Maine, a place that remembers the long and still happening presence and stewardship of the Wabanaki, people of the Dawn, the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet. And along with our guests, Hannah and Anu, I'm joined today by my colleagues at the BTS Center, and I invite you, my dear and esteemed colleagues, to wave as I name you each. Alan Ewing Merrill, our executive director, is here with us today. Hi, Alan. As well as Ash Tiemann, who serves as our communications manager. Hi, Ash. Ash and I actually just recently co-facilitated a 4-week book study of Words for a Dying World, which was one program among many that we've hosted recently here at the BTS Center with a focus on the theme of eco-grief, which is what we'll be talking about in just a little bit. Thanks to Ash and Alan for your support today with tech and being present in the chat box. Along with Ash and Alan, we're also joined by my colleague, Nicole Dieroff, the program director at the BTS Center. Hey, Nicole.
Hey, Aram, and hello to all of you. I am so grateful to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. I have been looking forward to this time with Hannah and Anu for quite a while. In the introduction to Words for a Dying World, Hannah speaks about the ways in which grief is particular to both time and place, which indeed is a reflection of the Christian understanding of incarnation. She says, when we choose a grief orientation that properly reflects our finitude as creatures, we participate in God's orientation towards the earth, the one who takes on flesh to dwell among flesh in time and space and tastes death. This changes our nature and changes the nature of the things we grieve. They become to us what they already are to God, beloved. So as we reflect on our particular location and time and place, I invite you to show up in this particular Zoom room. Please open the chat and share as you feel comfortable. What geographical location, what particular geographical location are you zooming in from today? Go ahead and put that in the chat. I am seeing Maryland and Connecticut, Maine, the UK, our friends staying up late with us, West Virginia, Boston, Connecticut. Welcome to our friend in South Africa, New York, Hawaii, welcome. and so much more. Thank you, friends. Now I invite you to put in the chat, what is something you honor or appreciate about that particular location where you find yourself today? Your particular location on the planet. What is something you honor or appreciate about that place? I'm seeing proximity to coast. I'm seeing hiking trails, tropical winds, the tides influenced by the moon, fog, big skies, closeness to family. Someone on an iPhone has 12 months of gardening. Awesome. Foliage, seasons, the ancient angel mounds of the native peoples. Thank you, friends, for all of those appreciations. And finally, as we locate ourselves in time, what meaning does this particular day that we call December 16, 2021 hold for you? What meaning does this day in time hold for you? I'm seeing exactly 1 week after my birthday. I'm seeing that it is the season of Advent. Oh my gosh, it might be Paul's birthday today. If that's the truth, happy birthday, Paul! Coziness of darkness in this season. Observance of a beautiful day, the solstice. Someone who loves the number 16. Reconciliation Day in South Africa. Lovely. Thank you for sharing this day with this group of people on this topic with us. We are so grateful to you for showing up for this conversation and community. So as we move forward, please feel free to make use of the chat as it makes sense for you. If you find the chat distracting, please close it down and focus on what you are hearing. But if you find the chat helpful, please feel free to contribute your own thoughts and questions in that space. Alan will be serving as chat chaplain today and will be attending to what you're sharing and asking in that space.
Thank you, Nicole. I love that, chat chaplain. It's so good. And now as we move into engagement with big questions and big grief, I'm lighting this bit of incense to serve as smoldering prayer on our behalf. That in deep loss, we may find great courage, and that in our wrestling, though we may walk away with a limp, we might take heart in our new identity and in new ways of relating with the world, with our kin, and with the divine. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Aram. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Hannah Malcolm. Hannah is ordinand in the Church of England and is writing her PhD on a theology of climate and ecological grief. She's on the board of Operation Noah and regularly speaks and writes about climate justice and the church. She is the editor for this book we're going to be referencing throughout today, Words for a Dying World, stories of grief and courage from the global church. We're so very pleased that you said yes to this invitation to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I am pleased to introduce Anupama Ranawana. Anu is a theologian and political economist with over 8 years of experience working in academia and international development. Her research and teaching expertise and interests are focused on gender and justice, decolonial thought, diversifying research methodological practice, religious thought in the global South, faith and international development, and the intersections between racial and climate justice. She holds advanced degrees in theology and international politics. Her most recent publication has been on the importance of women's religious thought to global politics. And she's currently working on her first book, congratulations, Anu, A Liberation for the Earth, Reflections on Race, Climate, and Cross, which you'll be able to hold in your hands next year, 2022, thanks to SCM Press. Welcome, Anu. So glad that you're with us.
Great to be here.
And I also just want to say a quick welcome to Deborah Murphy. I saw who's joining us in the crowd out there. Deborah is also a contributor to this book, Chapter 33. So welcome, Deborah, there from Appalachia region. Anu, I wonder if you could maybe, as we start off here, read the opening segment from The Sinking Island, from the title of your essay, In Words for a Dying World.
Certainly, it's my pleasure. Every year, the island was a little less. Look, my father would tell us, distracting our teenage minds from bathing in rock pools. Can you see where the waves reach? One day, all of this will sink beneath the sea. Standing in front of the ocean as a child, then a teenager, and then an adult, I was always possessed of the feeling of potent destruction contained in the waves, of the enormity of that which is to come. I think of the lines from the poet Rabindranath Tagore. Destruction dances on the vast ocean waves, a fearful festival. Beating its 100 wings, the storm wind raves in furious squall. Ocean and sky conjoin, fierce intercourse. Unseeing, unhearing, frenzied giants come, homeless, loveless forms. Where do they rush to die, bursting all bonds? To the cosmos we belong, and to the cosmos we will return. For even the island that gives us nourishment and life must submit to this rule. This was the first theological lesson I ever received.
That's profoundly personal and particular, and I'm eager to lean into kind of some of the intentionality behind that in the book as a whole. I am curious, Anu, with from your first theological lesson, how that has maybe evolved into your current work. I'm especially intrigued by the ways that you are articulating a theology of weeping. That was a new concept to me. But how has, from that first theological lesson to what you're working in, what you're engaging now, how has your evolution taken place?
Thanks, Aram. It's quite interesting, and until you'd asked me that question, I'd never really thought about how to answer that. And I've been trying to answer it all week, and I don't think I have a very good answer. But when I look at this idea of we belong to the cosmos and to the cosmos we return, I can see in there, first of all, I think the interreligiousness of my upbringing, where I had a Catholic mother and a Buddhist father, where I grew up all over Asia. And so I can see there also a particular understanding of the relationship with the divine that you also see in Islam. This idea of interrelatedness and the interrelationship with the cosmos, which I suppose I didn't realize as a child that was what I was learning as well. And as my theological journey shapes and shifts and changes, the idea of a theology of weeping has come from that moment of thinking about how weeping cleans your eyes and makes them see the world anew and different. How do we engage with the social and ecological death that's around us? That's really what a theology of weeping, as I began to enter it, was about. But another thing that, very recently, I was asked to write a chapter on, apologies as a cat, on trauma. And I was thinking about the multiplicity of trauma, not only as one event, but these constant events where not only individually, but collectively, groups, we are going through the problem of constant trauma, this constant remaking of self, constantly seeing something new, and the inability to go back to that former self, whether the collective or the individual. And what links that really is this constant, I think, a kind of a weeping that pours out, whether it's intergenerational, whether it's multiple in different ways. That's what it is. And I think it is a theology of weeping that also drives certain kinds of mobilizations. I look at, if you look at the, there's so many, for example, women out on the streets who are protesting against ecological devastation, and that comes out of their own weeping for what is occurring within their communities and within the world itself. And that theology of weeping, I think, is a space of mobilization. And I think it's also generative. And now in my theological work, I'm talking about the concept of rage a lot, to move from that space of grief through weeping, through rage, and what rage means theologically. So that's really sort of where I am. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that exchange. Hannah, I wonder if we might turn to you. And as we're towards the beginning of this conversation, I was hoping you might share a bit of the why behind this collection called Words for a Dying World, which you edited. And I wonder if you also might share something with us from one of the many contributors that points to, that speaks to that original why behind the project for you.
Yeah, so I think my why for the project is connected to my own story. One of the things I find a lot when people speak about climate and ecological grief is they'll speak about a sort of before or after, that they can roughly point to a time or a location where they moved from one kind of unawareness to a kind of awareness. And I think my own experience of grief is wrapped up in that. There's a writer called Aldo Leopold who talks about an ecological education being one which is lonely, because you basically walk through a world of wounds when you know the state of the world. And for me, growing up, my granddad was a climate scientist and a Christian, so I never really had a sense of there being any conflict between my faith and the need for climate justice. That was really drilled into me from quite a young age. But there was a sort of naivety in my trust in, I suppose, institution, or in the power of adults saying truthful things. And so I had absorbed the idea that by the time I was an adult, climate change would be a problem that had been solved. And I think the experience of reaching the end of that naivety, discovering the true state of things, combined with, I think, an increasing exposure to my own complicity. So one of the kinds of knowledge that I think can provoke climate and ecological grief in the parts of the world where we are further removed from its consequences is the realization that these webs of extractive capitalism are ones that we cannot really disentangle ourselves from. So we can do our best, but it's like peeling layers back from an onion. And when I was a teenager, my parents became guardians for three teenagers from the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and that was my first real encounter with the truth about the ways that violence against the land is violence against people, and that interwoven narrative. So the book was a why, because it was a, well, there's these grief experiences, but the church's response to climate breakdown and ecological collapse has really been to make green to-do lists. We write longer and longer lists of good things that people should do. And that seemed insufficient as a response to the kind of the spiritual collapse, as well as the biological one. So one of the texts that comes to mind in that process of wanting to find a way to speak about climate grief, which would be spiritually meaningful, and a kind of a fitting response to the true nature of the world. There's one of the accounts of the book is written by a Maori priest named Christopher Douglas Hurawai, and he quotes the psalmist in asking, how can we sing a song of the Lord in a foreign land? And he speaks about a foreign land as being the place where he is that has been made foreign to him by the breakdown of human relationship to the land around him. So he explores the way that for his people, identity is land and land is identity. And so knowledge of God and God's call comes through the land. It doesn't come apart from it. And it's true for all of us to greater or lesser degrees, that we are the product of essentially land-based ancestries and belongings, whether that's because we're part of a people whose belonging has been wrapped up in land, or because we're part of a people whose sense of identity has been wrapped up in extracting other people from their land, in erasing the histories of other relationships to land. So there's this relationship between land and history that became really important in thinking through what the book was trying to do, that grief is not something which is, this climate and ecological grief is not limited to the here and now, and it's also not a future only experience. It's not only anxiety. It's about a much longer dysfunction in our relationship to the land around us. And if I can just briefly share a quotation from a theologian whose work has influenced my own, which picks up on this, the problem of our spiritual identity. It's a French theologian called Jean-Louis Chrétien, and he says, if we could no longer speak of the world, we would no longer have anything to say. The Holy Bible itself speaks of God only by speaking of the world, of its creation, its history, the human beings who live in it, the animals, the rivers, the mountains and the deserts, the winds and the bushes, of God giving the world and giving himself for the salvation of the world. So this book was trying to, I think, explore what happens when we lose sight of our place in the world, or worse, we cause others to lose sight of their place in the world, and the kind of blasphemy that brings about. So I think Reverend Douglas Hurawai's chapter really powerfully brought that across for me.
Thank you. I wanted to say amen a couple times during what you were saying. Thank you so much for that sharing. Anu, is there another author in this collection that you might want to spotlight, because for you their piece really gets at the heart of why this collection is so important?
Yes, I often teach with Sophia Chiron-Gomez's essay, which I think is extremely powerful piece, particularly when, and I think this is what Hannah was doing a little bit earlier, of when you're walking through and you notice certain things, and she talks about how she sees the bones and the death, and she wonders how something that meant life has become death. And that's not a question that stands, I think, in that moment, but as Hannah says, is standing for all time through history. It reminded me of, in the 1980s, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines put out a statement, a letter called "What has happened to our beautiful land?" And very purposefully, they don't use an interrogation mark; they use a full stop, a period. And you can see in that directly that it's not only about lamentation, but it is about this very forthright statement of how the land is being constantly, rapaciously broken apart, and how that's contributing to death-creating structures that also maintain death for the peoples who live upon the land. And so I think I can see that sort of reverberation between Sophia's work and that particular statement. If I can also quote from a theologian, if that's okay, this is the Vietnamese theologian C.S. Song, who reminds us that we have to remember those interrelationships, because creation, apprehended in the perspective of redemption, is the true foundation of human community, in which begins the kingdom of God, that links all humanity in a common kinship and blood relationship. And I think that's really what we see when we contemplate that link between life and death, and how what was meant to be life has become death. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to invite anyone who's with us today, if you're someone who has engaged with this book, and I know some of you are because we were in a book study together, but if you have a favorite author or essay or quote and you want to pop that in the chat, please do so.
Indeed. And I feel as if I probably speak for the others here that Anu and Hannah, if you would like to at some point share those quotes with us in the chat, I could imagine reflecting on them much more than just in this space. So not to give you an assignment to type and talk at the same time, but so something that I feel like has surfaced in different conversations and the many different programs that we've been offering around ecological grief, and this kind of earth-sized existential problem came to mind because Hannah, you were talking about how we can't disentangle ourselves from extractive capitalism, and Anu, the structures that, one of those structures that maintains death, right? And these really like layered upon layer upon layer upon layer of entanglement can lead to an experience of despair, a posture of despair. I'm not even really sure, but I know the question has come up in a number of different conversations about the distinction between grief and despair, whether or not there is a distinction, what that distinction might be. I know I've been dancing with that question. I wonder if either of you has some insight into that, how you talk about grief alongside of despair and vice versa, whether there's a distinction, what that is, what other theological concepts might like come into that conversation.
Yeah, sure. So one of the, I guess, questions that I ask in my own research is whether the ways we currently speak about grief in the West, the sort of Western developed context, are helpful or true as descriptions of our relationship to the world around us, and also of the ways that grief shapes us. So a pretty pervasive assumption that I find in a lot of psychological and anthropological literature is that grief is essentially passive, in that it just happens to you. So it's unbidden. It's a private experience. So your grief really just belongs to you, and it's something you have to process in your own way, that's unique to you. And as a result of those two things, that it's a sort of morally neutral state, that if you are feeling grief, then your grief is valid, and that your experiences of grief can't be questioned or brought under any kind of scrutiny by a community around you, or even by yourself. And this is quite far removed from the ways that sorrow has been understood in the Christian tradition. So one of the things that I think is helpful for us in trying to differentiate grieving or sorrowing and despair is looking at the ways that they've been framed prior to our sort of pathologizing of grief, where it becomes almost like a medical condition, which we can treat, but basically isn't really up for scrutiny. One of the things which we learn from that longer tradition is that grief is a kind of learned behavior, that it reflects the directions of our desires, the things that we have taught ourselves are worthy of grieving. And we do see this emerging a little bit in 20th century political philosophy. So Judith Butler talks about grievable bodies, for example, the kinds of bodies that as a society we deem grievable. And actually Deborah Murphy's chapter in the book picks up this idea of grievable bodies in relation to the people of the Appalachian Mountains. But it has a much longer history, this idea that grief is a reflection of the direction of our desires. And so it's a kind of learned response to the world. And despair is a sort of differentiated, despair is almost what takes place when our grief becomes kind of out of sync with the kinds of reason or learning that can help to shape grief in fruitful or morally beneficial ways. So grief as a response to sin and death in the world, but which is expressed out of ourselves, expressed into community, and expressed towards God in prayer as its proper direction, can be transformative for us morally. It can help to teach us what is worthy of grief and what is not. So it's possible for us to grieve bad things, basically, is maybe one of the things I want to suggest to you this evening, that our grief can be misdirected. We could have misunderstood what's worthy of grief. One of the consequences of grief not being placed under the kind of consideration or scrutiny which can take place in community, which can take place when we direct our grief towards God, is that this grief can become very inward focused, and it can take on the shape of despair, particularly because despair is no longer interested in what is really true about the world. So grief tries to respond, I think, at its best to something which is true about the world. Despair assumes that we already know the future and that there's nothing that can be done. Okay, so that's the basis upon which despair rests. And that's a kind of hubris. So it's not based in reality. We cannot know the future. And we also cannot know whether there's nothing to be done. That's not information that we have. I'm particularly interested in despairing language in the minority world context, which I'm in, and the danger or the power that that holds. So I think one of the reasons that I found despairing language or despairing attitudes to be so prevalent in my own context is that the culture that I've emerged from is a post-colonial one, which is founded on the assumption of superior capacity for rule. So the idea that in the West, we've imagined ourselves as the problem solvers and architects of the earth. And while we've now realized that's not true, we still assume our position is one from which salvation will emerge. And when we've failed to produce that kind of salvation, we struggle to imagine that an alternative is possible. So despair is rooted in a kind of untruth, but it can also be a warning to us that we've misdirected our grief. It's become an inward focused thing. It's interested in our own experience and not the experience of others. So that would be a starting point, albeit quite a wordy one.
Yeah, that is a good starting point to quite a journey. Nicole, I wonder if you might kind of tie what we're talking about into some of what we've been exploring with spiritual leadership in a climate changed world, and the role of religious leaders, what they play.
I think you should go where you want to go, Aram.
Okay.
With that question.
Okay, awesome. I didn't want to hog the mic. Well, so there's I'm thinking about, Anu, you're talking about weeping, like actual tears that are sort of like a baptism of the eyes, right? A kind of baptizing our perspective. And also thinking about Hiroe's essay, Hannah, that you referenced, and the idea of the land is me and I am the land. I just recently read something from Ched Meyer's Gospel of Mark commentary about being baptized, not just in a river, but into a river. And this idea of kind of like of a full immersion into this experience and coming out changed, whether it's a changed perspective or changed orientation. There's a segment, a quote, Anu, from your essay that has been very stirring for me, where you said that theologies that reflect on a dying world must harvest the energy of sorrow and grief to engender a spiritual revolution. And so I'm wondering about the relationship between grief and activism, or grief and vocation, or grief and our response that goes beyond listing off green to-do lists. How is our experience of grief bound up with our convictions for justice and repair, our role as spiritual leaders? That's a big question. Anu, do you have any thoughts about that, about the relationship between grief and activism? Feels like too simple, maybe a formulation, but what do you think?
It is a very big question. Grief, I think what Hannah said is so important, and it wraps up what I was trying to say in what it feels now like a rather grandiose sentence. Grief outpours, despair is inward. And quite often when I'm listening to and having discussions with students, colleagues, the despair is, there's a difficulty with grief that, as Hannah says, gets mixed up in despair, because it's not only about the fact that there is no hope, but it's also about an inward sense of, oh, what will I have to lose individually, that does not realize generations, histories of loss, histories of death, right? The history of grief that we have in the world, that we have in so many communities around the world. I always think about this quote from Christina Sharp, who's a Black theorist, and she says that we have to have that outpouring of grief because for so many, there has never been a choice about sitting with despair. There's a very, I think there's a kind of a privilege with despair in a way that we need to push against. And that's, I suppose, when we think about grief that outpours, grief that is collective, then it pours out into what we might call activism. And this idea of activism, in a way, or organizing, is about the importance of liberation that is for all, right? If you look at liberation theologians, for example, or third-world theologians, or whatever you want to use the term for, what are they telling us to do? They have said to us that the salvific nature of our faith is recognizing that justice is not something that happens at the end in the eschaton. It is about building the kingdom now. That is the essence of what we have. So if we understand grief that outpours, that means that we are mobilized, we are sent out to do, we are sent out to change and to bring the world into right relationships. So we talked a little bit about sinfulness in our pre-conversation, and when we talk about ecological sinfulness, and I apologize, I'm a Catholic, so I'm going to quote a Pope. Pope Francis, when he talks about ecological sinfulness, what he means is the fact that we have moved away from right relationship with God by not recognizing that cosmological dimension. So perhaps the divine also grieves, and that grief is outpouring upon us. Gregory of Nazianzus in the 4th century actually made this link between injustice and extreme weather, and he quotes John 4:38 to ask us, where did we harvest where we did not plant? And I think that is the central grief question that then translates into activity, or should translate into activity, when we reflect on what Leonardo Boff calls the two bleeding wounds, one which is social death, the other which is the death and the dying of the earth. So yeah, that's where I am. Thanks.
If I can just jump in, because what Anu said has reminded me of a line from a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, who says, "I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. I am not on his payroll." And I think one of the things that connects, that's from the poem Conscientious Objector. And one of the things that I think Anu's just expressed beautifully in this connection between grief and activism is that in the practice of grief, we face the real consequences of our death making. And grief properly expressed, theologically speaking, involves a kind of repentance, a bitterness over the taste of death, and would involve a turning from the works of death, that we can say, I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. I am not on his payroll. And the next couple of lines, she goes on and she says, I will not tell him the whereabouts of my friends, nor of my enemies either. That there's a kind of responsibility that grief awakens in us for those that are both known and unknown to us, because it makes us face the real bitterness of death.
Thank you. This conversation is making me think about some of the things that we do liturgically in church, confession, and how we orient. I'm interested in your thoughts on how we orient towards ritual. So, Anu, I'm going to start with you as the BTS Center is exploring spiritual leadership in a climate changed world. I often find myself reflecting on the role religious leaders play as meaning-making professionals. And we have several ways that we engage in meaning-making, but one of those is through ritual. And in your essay, I was particularly drawn to the couple sentences where you reference Michael Northcott and say, he has argued that we may use traditional rituals from our faith communities that can shape approaches to climate justice, particularly the actions of pilgrimage, sanctuary, and Eucharist. To this, I venture to add that of ritual mourning and weeping. So I wonder if you could share a little more about how you think about and imagine the potential impact of ritual, and in particular that one, this weaves back to a theology of weeping, but what does the ritual aspect of that theology look like in response to climate change?
Thanks, Nicole. I'll answer that in two ways. One, when I think about a theology of rituals of mourning, I think about my particular context as a South Asian. Mourning is loud. It's lamentation. The lamentations are raised loud and high. If you ever go to Sri Lanka, you'll always know when someone is dead because there'll be a big flag of some kind, and you'll know the name of the person, you know their religion, you know their whole life history. There is a kind of it percolates everywhere, that sense of loss, of grief, that outpouring, and you share that together. You take food to each other. It's significant. So on one level, I'm thinking about that from my cultural context. And whether you're Christian or Buddhist or whatever, we all have that same level of ritualized mourning, where we mourn together and we support each other. But at the same time, I was also very moved. I did my MDiv in Canada, and I learned very much from the First Nations community that was there about the importance of silence as mourning. Silence in standing with the land, with the rivers, and understanding the deep sense of loss. So there were, of course, there's the activity of ritual, of what you burn and what you say and what you chant and what you dance. But within that also was this incredibly beautiful moment of grief-filled silence, just that moment of that. And I kind of wonder about how we bring into our liturgies, if you will, both the ululations of loss and the silence of loss, and what that would mean, and how that would kind of transform or allow us to enter into spaces of activity, really, because I think that the role we do have as faith-based persons is to engender, as I say in the book, a moral awakening of what is happening now, what has happened, and what is to happen, and to reclaim that hope. And in liturgies, lift you up into that sense of hope. So I think that's what I was thinking there. Thanks.
That holding of silence, which is really, that gave me a very strong visual. That was not individual, that was community. Is that true? Yeah. So I think this is well, first of all, I want to say, if anyone has comments or questions they want to pop into the chat, we're going to start orienting a little more towards the direction you would like to go shortly. So please, as we continue to talk, feel free to put in a response to anything that we've been saying, and or a question that you would love to ask either of our guests. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I want to go down this path of community as compared to individual grief. And Hannah, I feel like you were speaking about this really clearly in the distinction between despair. That actually the authentic grief is when it's directed towards God, when it's involved with community. And so I wonder what you might want to add to this conversation about ritual, and what it looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like, to have this happen in collective ways as compared to private ways.
Yeah, sure. So one of the ways that we can practice grief well over the world around us is to ensure that that grief is expressed as shared. So to know the world well, to pay attention to it, the world around us, is how we learn to love it. We cannot know it well if the only experience of the world which we encounter is our own. We share the world around us with many other creatures, human and non-human. And if we do not have the capacity to attend to their experiences of the world as best we can, then our understanding of the world around us will be limited. To fully express grief over the death of that shared life, that shared environment, as an echo of that, we must be able to attend to a particularity of diverse grief stories and histories, which belong to each other, which necessitate sharing. So one of the, I guess, if we think about ritual, one of the questions that I always want to ask is, well, what is this for? What does this say? What mystery does this point to when we do this thing? One of the things that we're doing when we try and speak about a kind of grief ritual over the earth or over the sin that has perpetuated this kind of collapse, is to say that we've had an incomplete, we've had a diminished picture. We've deliberately kept ourselves from the stories of others. And that's how we have permitted this to go on for so long. And so now we will listen to these other stories as a kind of basis for thinking about this. Now, I'm training to be a priest in the Church of England, so my attention will then immediately go to, well, how is this understood in our liturgical practice, in what we do when we gather as the body of Christ, as the church? One particular example I want to draw your attention to is what takes place when we participate in public prayer. So when I say public prayer, I'm referring to prayer which takes place in a publicly accessible building and is spoken out loud. When we pray together in public, when we name particular prayers as a community, both, I believe, our prayer participates in the work of God in the world in some mysterious way. I do believe that. But I also believe that our prayer shapes us as a community. It teaches us the direction of divine compassion. So if our prayers, which are expressed together, are limited in their attention to those within our own community, to those whose stories are most palatable to us, who cause us the least discomfort, then we will not have our attention redirected. It will not be oriented towards divine compassion. But when we pray together as a gathered community for those who are on the margins of our community, who are usually, when we pray as in this public way, we pray for the vulnerable, the marginalized, the sick, the grieving, those who are approaching death. That's a kind of a tradition of that sort of intercession. We tend to pray for those places in the world which particularly need the compassion of God. And so when we do that kind of work, we're forming a kind of attention together. We're learning to attend in a new way to the world around us. So that's one example that's already a practice in our church communities, which we can look at and think, well, how can that regular practice of praying for others, interceding in ways which directs our attention, incorporate this kind of grief response? So that would be one way I'd suggest is a pretty straightforward way of thinking about what happens when we participate in public prayer. Where is it directed? Who have we deemed to be a recipient of God's compassion when we say these prayers? And where is our focus going? Yeah, that would be one example of how that is lived out in our church communities.
Lovely. I just have to say this concept of, is this grief I'm feeling worthy of bringing to God and praying aloud in community, and that as a discernment tool around love and what matters, that for sure I am holding as you know, we're not at the end of the conversation yet, but just to name that's really struck me powerfully. Aaron, where shall we go next?
Yeah, great question. I'd love to give the opportunity for some of the folks here with whom we are gathered to ask some questions, share anything that's kind of surfacing for you. So please avail yourself of the chat box to do that if you have some questions. And I wonder, while we're giving some folks some time to formulate those questions, Hannah, would you be willing to read a portion from one of your contributions? You wrote the introduction and the conclusion. You framed the text. Would love to hear.
Yeah,
some.
Sure. So I'll read a couple of paragraphs from the conclusion, which is called World
Okay.
Without End, and is a reflection on Christ's resurrection and ascension in relation to our climate and ecological grief. I am not suggesting that grieving a dying world as a Christian is all that different to the grief of someone who does not believe our destruction will be redeemed. We share common griefs, even though our experiences are shaped by the particular places to which we belong. Grief is, for all of us, a means of survival, a healthy way to deal with immense suffering. It prevents us from becoming bitter or closed off or indifferent. Grief, especially when shared with others, can make us more generous, tender people. And I think we grieve in order to be honest about how things are and how we are. So much of the death around us springs from gameful dishonesty. Dishonesty about the sanctity of each creature, dishonesty about the likely consequences of our actions, and covering up those consequences when they happen. If we cannot bring ourselves to be truthful about our broken histories or the current trauma we face and perpetuate, we cannot begin to heal. Survival, compassion, honesty, these are all good reasons to grieve. But the conviction that Christ's resurrection marked the death of death also contains the hope that our works of love in the present are not consigned to destruction. They participate in a transformed future.
Thank you. One of the things I think this book has been helpful for us, which I think was part of your hope and intention, is that in engaging with the stories of others from many different locations and reflecting past, present, future, that it leads to a desire to articulate our own story. And so we've started to think about this location that the BTS Center is in here in Maine, in the United States, and what is our story to contribute to this sort of collective. And I wonder how you guided Hannah and Anu, how you were guided to share the story that you shared, and what you would recommend to, I'm here in Maine. We have people from many different places. How do we go about crafting these stories that are honest, that that lead to hope, that lead to repair, that lead to courage? Maybe if we can be honest enough. Anu, do you want to start with that, and then Hannah, you obviously as editor helped people craft their stories, but Anu, what would you say from the experience of having written one?
I have to say that, at least in my case, Hannah she didn't put any sort of impositions on this is what I want. And to be fair, I chased it to say, can I write in your book? And
nice. I like knowing that.
I just completely stalked for it. And we would, as an editor, we would just love to sort of, and essentially outpour on the page and encourage to be as, I think, as personal as we could be. And I think that was very much the key to the writing process, and the ability to speak out and to be able to center the personal experience, as well as, I think, that the reflection from the personal to the collective, in that way. And that was very freeing, that there was no imposition from the editor. There was very much this kind of open space to weep on the page. And I think that was important. I think when I read all the essays, I can see that sense that's coming out. Every voice is so different, so multiple. And I think that's why it's a powerful book.
Thank you. I know this is drawing back a little bit, but I just saw, Anu, that you shared something in the chat as a follow-up to the last exchange we had around ritual. And I just, for anyone who has their chat closed down, would want to give you a moment to say that, so that we can hear that follow-up thought.
Oh, certainly. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, when we're talking about ritual, is one of the sort of really powerful examples, is the Filipino theologian Ano speaks about the indigenous peoples of the Grand Cordillera who use ritual to tell the story, to keep telling the story, and the importance of storytelling to ritual. And the example he gives is the patong dance, which tells the tale of hope, really. It's about anti-colonial resistance to development aggression, and then interweaving that with this understanding of cosmic community. So it's at once the story of resistance, but also the importance of, there is this journey of hope against death, and in that sense, it really is a cosmic story. If we think about Christ who died on the cross, that is, again, that cosmic battle against death. So that's very much what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you for that. That starts to touch on a very succinct question that someone sent me, and that is, what is the relationship between grief and resurrection?
I have some thoughts about this.
I thought you might.
I'm gonna try and make this short, but I think it's fascinating that one of the things that really occupied the minds of early church theologians when they were asking themselves about the nature of Christ's humanity is, why does he grieve? Why does Christ sorrow? We have these instances of Christ sorrowing in the scriptures. One of which is at the tomb of Lazarus, who he will imminently raise from the dead. And another is his deep trouble before his own crucifixion, even though he knows it's the means of salvation, right? So why does Christ express this deep utterance of sorrow, of weeping, of grief, despite this knowledge of resurrection, of both his power to raise from the dead and also the salvation which will come about through his death? And I think one of the things that comes out in their thinking on this is that Christ sorrows not just over a specific kind of death, but over the brokenness which that death represents. That it's a sorrowing, Augustine describes it, over a great mass of sin. That's how he talks about Christ's sorrow at the tomb of Lazarus, that there's this great mass of sin which causes Christ to weep. And that his sorrow before he dies is an example to us of the deep trouble that, the deep troubling that death should bring about in us, but that does not reach despair. So it goes back to this differentiation between sorrowing and despair again, that belief in resurrection, in the possibility of transformation, of healing, helps to contain our grief in its fitting place, in its right orientation. It does not allow death to control us. We react against it, we withdraw from it, but it is not ultimately in control. And that's where they see Christ's sorrow as both an example to us and also an expression of his solidarity with those who are the sorrowing of the earth. So I'd say that's one of the intimate links between grief and resurrection, is that resurrection does not permit grief to become despair. I think the second thing is that resurrection is a declaration of the wrongness of death, of the wrongness of the death of the world. And in a conviction in resurrection, we don't just stop at trying to justify death to ourselves as something inevitable or something that can't be controlled, but we announce the death of death. So that would be where I'd begin to draw a relationship between the two of them. Yeah, and there's many more things, but I'll stop there for now.
Anu, just want to ask if there's anything you want to say in response to that.
No, I mean, Hannah obviously is, thinks so profoundly it's hard to follow up. But I think that is very key. And then thinking about, this idea of justice in the present, I'm always very struck when I think about two things. When I think about the accounts of the resurrection, one, there's a Sri Lankan theologian, Tisabala Surya, and he said this very profound thing. I think it's profound, that Christ only celebrated the Eucharist once, and 48 hours later, he had been put to death. These death-creating social structures. Even though resurrection is to come, I think that puts very much into perspective what that death meant. How we are immediately and explicitly put up against the sinfulness of structures that oppress, that exploit, that continue to exploit. And what does that mean for us thinking about collective struggle, right? The importance of us refusing systems that consistently put Christ to death, refusing resurrection. And I think also of Mary, I think always with Mary, if we consider Mother Mary as the ideal disciple standing at the foot of the cross, swinging between perhaps grief and despair and rage, even though she knows about salvation because she was told that in the Annunciation, she knows that there is something that is to come, but at the same time, how does she move from that? So I kind of wonder about that too. We, standing at the foot of the cross, have to then move to that particular point of knowing salvation, having known salvation, that stands for all time, and then remembering that the way to the resurrection is the defeat of death, and our responsibility is to work for that. Thanks.
Thank you. I actually would like to invite Paul Fraser to unmute and either read what he just put in the chat or say something similar. As we come towards the end of our time, I want to really honor that there are several people with us here today who went through a book study together. And Paul was one of those people, and I'd love Anu and Hannah for you to hear from him what this has meant to him, and then we'll allow each of you to have, you know, a final thought before we wrap this up. But Paul.
Well, I wrote that I have felt through these past weeks of our book study, as well as today's conversation, that this emphasis on climate grief has been perhaps the most significant and transformative experience for me in this past year of my life that I mark today. And as a facilitator of a community of practice for clergy, and as a pastor serving here in the Ohio Valley in Indiana, and also being responsible as I am for a number of our rural congregations along the valley, I want to commit my own time and life in this coming year to engaging in these conversations in a deeply different way, because this whole conversation lifts us from the political to the apolitical, from the personal to the corporate, and from despair to hope. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for Zoom that allows us to be together from Ohio to the UK to Maine and all these other places that we represent.
Happy birthday, Paul. We'd sing to you if it wasn't so awkward on Zoom.
Thank you for that.
Yes, happy birthday. Anu, do you want to share first, and then maybe Hannah, you can have a final word before we move into wrapping up.
I'm trying to formulate something quite good there. Thank you for what you've shared, Paul. I think that's really very moving in a way. And I think what you said about moving between these levels of the personal to the corporate and so on and so forth, it reorients us back to what we shared in the beginning of how entangled this process is. And we shouldn't be scared of that entanglement. I think sometimes people are scared to be entangled, but that is really how we I think move through the world, and that is why it's frightening, I think, to contemplate what we have to do, but we must do. I think there is no longer a space in which we can sit with our despair, but we must let our grief motivate us. We must let that grief, I think, pour into a sense of generative rage. Christ is never, I think, a passive sort of figure. Neither are those who follow him. They are in constant movement. They're in constant stages of emotion as well. That is the drama of it. And why do we resist that? Why do we resist and think of ourselves as living a passive faith? No, we are sent out. And we are sent out into this entanglement, into this complication, into the fact that we are complicit, and also into remembering that when we, I think there's quite often, there's a tendency in the Christian tradition to see the self versus the other. But that can be, I think, a bit condescending. It refuses the agency of the other. So we'll talk a lot about, the majority world being at the receiving end of climate exploitation and degradation, but that also refuses the agency. We have to listen to those voices. We have to let those voices be at the center of things. We must, from a faith-based filled rage and emotion, say to our leaders, why are those people being shut out of the negotiating tables? The greatest grief, I think, at the moment that we should all be feeling is that the language of loss and damage was refused on the global stage. What does that mean? It is denying agency to those who have been speaking for generations about their loss and their grief. In fact, loss and grief is only occurring to the Western world now, but it's been happening for a long time. No one's been listening, and that's what we have to do. We are a salvific faith. And we are called to listen, and we are called to act. And to do that, we have to be unafraid of entanglement and complication. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Hannah.
I want to just finish with a brief example of a moment where I saw, to kind of, I guess, echo the question that Jim asks, and also Alan brings out around lament, where I saw this grief and this witness come together. And it was the Ash Wednesday before the pandemic, whichever year that was. And I was involved in a protest which took place outside of a coal mine, a proposed coal mine site in County Durham, where I live in England, which is an old mining community, and yet that community had profoundly rejected the proposed new coal mine. They did not want it. And a group of us joined a protest which was taking place outside of this coal mine, and we held an Ash Wednesday liturgy. And we marked the heads of those who gathered with a mixture of ash and a kind of oil. And we said the words of the Ash Wednesday liturgy and reminded them that they were dust, and to dust they would return and turn to Christ. And mixed in with that expression of acknowledging death, and also of there's a call to repentance mixed in that acknowledgement of death. And so I suppose the reflection I'd want to come away with is that one of the things we really struggle with in our conversations around climate and ecological grief is how to talk about sin. And if nothing else, the church should be able to identify sin in the world and reject it, where it emerges in the church's own body and where we see it outside of the church. So those rituals, those expressions of our faith in public, which also help others to speak about the sin that we do to the world in ways which have a kind of tangible meaning, a public witness, I think, are particularly powerful. And I share that story to encourage you that your grief is not limited to the sort of inner sphere or community that you're involved in. But I encourage you to find opportunities to connect that with existing work that takes place and the existing griefs of others in your community, in your area, who are trying to find ways to express it well. And also, thank you. It's a real privilege that you've come this evening to talk about this with us. I'm really overwhelmed and humbled by you all being here. So thank you so much for your attention. Especially thank you to those of you who participated in the book study. That's a real honor and a privilege that I never imagined would happen when we put this together. So yeah, a thank you to you, and thank you to the BTS Center.
Thank you. I so appreciate that charge, that charge to all of us. Thank you. Hannah and Anu will read what's in the chat if you have any words for them, including just to honor some of the questions that were really good and we didn't get to, but to know that simply asking the questions sometimes is important. So feel free, if you want to put any words of gratitude, to put them in there. I'm going to share just a couple ways that you might consider continuing the journey with us, and then actually we'll have a chance for any who want to linger for a little bit. After this, we'll be keeping the Zoom meeting open and forming a breakout room for any of you who participated in the book study who want to reunite and reflect together on some of what you heard. So first, I want to just name that this season focused on ecological grief has been really unique in terms of the programming of the BTS Center and the way in which we approach this. And we are actually really eager for your feedback at this point. So I will be sharing a invitation to participate in a survey with all of you and everyone who took part in these programs. And if you could take a few minutes to help us out by offering your feedback I would really welcome that. At least one of our questions actually came directly from Hannah and Anu, and we'll be sharing with them some of your feedback. So it's important to them too. And we're going to give away a few more copies of this book to people who fill out the survey. So if you don't have it already, or if you do, you can get another copy and pass it on to a friend. I also want to name that we are into a 5-part series called Lament with Earth, which is happening seasonally. And Ash is going to drop some links in the chat for you, but we would love for you to be part of that series, Lament with Earth. It's an opportunity to gather and lament together, along with some amazing musicians and liturgists, a group called The Many. So if you check out that website, you can see the 2 videos that we have already shared as part of that series, and we welcome you to join us. Our next one is in early February. And last but not least, I want to invite you, if this theme of spiritual leadership in a climate change world is something that you'd like to dive in deeper with, Aram is going to be leading a course as a partnership with the School of Global Citizenry called Wildness and Spirituality for the Common Good. It's an asynchronous offering, so you will be guided through readings and opportunities to reflect and be part of a community, but there's not a particular time you need to sign on every week. So we invite you to think about joining us for that opportunity too, as a way of going deeper. Aram, I'm going to turn the virtual mic to you to help us end here.
Thank you, Nicole. And allow me to offer a benediction for us. As you go, may you find the clarity you need to share your stories of grief. May you find comfort as you ground your experience among the stories of others. May you let your grief motivate you, move you to weeping, move you to rage. May you welcome the complications of a moving and movable faith. May you find the courage you need to harvest the energy of sorrow and grief to engender a spiritual revolution. May it be so. Go with peace and in good faith.